So next up here, we have Dr. Carah Ong Whaley. She is Vice President at Issue 1. And we also have her joined by Claire Woodall, a Senior Advisor in Issue 1 and former election official, also a former member of BPC's Task Force on Elections. So I'll go ahead and welcome them to the stage.
Hello, it is so wonderful to spend this day with you all. It's like all my favorite people in the same room, and to get to see people in real life, people I've only met virtually over the last few years. So thank you all so much for coming today, and we're just delighted for Issue 1 to co-sponsor this event with all of the other amazing partners in this space. To set up our discussion today, as we all know, we were anticipating a lot of threats, and a lot of the ways that we at Issue 1 in particular, and then more broadly within the Elections Communications Hub, were considering our work was the rise in threats, harassment, and intimidation against election officials, and how could we counter false information that is spread so much through our information ecosystem by providing credible information. This is brand new data that we just are getting back, and I haven't fully gone through everything yet, but just some quick top lines from some new survey data that we got back this month that was fielded post-election with Citizen Data. You can see from the slide that majority of people said that they saw inaccurate information a lot, or very often, or somewhat often for the presidential election. And of course, there's also some Pew research showing that this year. And so we were faced in this election cycle with a fire hose, I've called it, a fire hose of false information circulating, and false information also amplified by bot networks on both the left and the right. And a lot of the things that we did in tracking the false narratives that we saw this throughout the election was seeing how specific election was amplified by bot comments, for example, within specific networks.
We also saw a direct correlation, as you all know, election officials in the room, of the spread of this disinformation on social media. And unlike 2020, where many of the platforms would flag what was potentially false information, we didn't see that content moderation this election cycle. And instead, we saw direct upticks in not just threats, but really just volume of phone calls and conspiracies, and putting a huge burden on election officials who are already facing huge volumes of calls during an election season, adding kind of the narrative, or the having to combat the narratives that you're seeing online and how quickly they would spread. We also saw on platforms like Facebook where it was auto-generating militia group pages. So huge changes in the information landscape within social media since 2020.
So as many of you who were part of the Elections Communications Hub or part of various campaigns know already from your experience, one of the most amplified narratives that we saw, and that we're going to focus on as just a specific example, was false information about non-citizens voting. So research we did with GQR and Redbud Consulting in September showed that majority of people were seeing the specific narrative about non-citizens voting illegally in elections. We also tracked this narrative. It was the #1 narrative, especially relative to other false claims about elections, so that's why we're focusing on it here. But just in terms of sheer volume, non-citizen voting was the highest narrative that we saw across social media. Again, the way we viewed this, and collectively through the Elections Communications Hub that Issue 1 co-convened with the Democracy Communication Collaborative, was thinking about a pipeline and how we could collectively respond to these issues. So we had regular narrative reports. We were tracking narratives online through various tools, and had partnered with Alethea, also with NewsGuard, Reality Defender, oh my gosh.
Dewey.
Oh, Dewey Defend. Yes, thank you. Dewey Defend, as well as as well as logically AI, to track all of the different narratives, to see where they were going, what volume was reached, and who the main perpetrators were. That allowed us, to see where it was coming from, to see consumption patterns at some extent, but also to make sure that both election officials and our groups in this space had a sense of what we needed to prepare for. As part of the Comms Hub, many of our groups also did message testing and research to see how we could best talk about this work and who the best messengers ought to be for that work. And so the real value, I think, was working in partnership with States United, with Campaign Legal Center, with all of our groups, with the DCC, with Citizen Data, to make sure that we were really coordinated on what our messages were, and to make sure that all of the groups in this space had that messaging. And our goal, of course, was always to boost confidence in elections and in the people who run them. And just want to shout out, particularly, we knew from research that we had done for the Elections Communications Hub, our focus was on the audience of quote unquote democracy shifters, people who may have questions about democracy. And so we were really focused on knowing that the best messengers for that credible messaging were veterans and faith-based leaders, business leaders, and election officials themselves. So thank you to all of you as election officials. I also want to shout out Chris Purdy and Ellen Gustafson, who were just amazing in terms of being willing to stand up and speak out in press briefings and online to help spread information. Credible information.
Credible and tested information, which was as a former election official, when I came to issue 1, I was like, you do message? I mean, I was like a little data geek that they were doing message testing and that I was doing it all wrong. I would always repeat the disinformation. I would be commenting on social media on the conspiracy theorists, promoting so that they got amplified to the top. So don't do what I did. I'm usually the last one to learn what to do on social media. But an example was when we saw the increase in the narrative, one of the candidates posted about non-citizens voting. We saw at the same time coordinated litigation in swing states. We already had non-citizen voting narratives ready to go. And the most effective messaging to people who were still swayable was that there's multiple safeguards in place. Every state has legal checks and balances to ensure only citizens vote in our elections. We would also remind in every single time we would speak that election officials are run by members of our community. And then always pivoting it back to the real threat to elections are false claims and the spread of this false information. So very coordinated, specific messaging that had already been tested and proven to be effective.
So I think just quick key lessons because we're running out of time. Research tested messaging, the right messengers, coordination across election officials, non-governmental organizations, and having the right messengers to give the message is really important. But also, I think we don't want to lose sight of the elephant in the room, that now all the information is gone. All the false information is no longer circulating, and this is probably something we're going to have to continue to deal with in the future. And so we really need to be thinking about, like, this problem has not gone away, so how do we continue to be effective and build on what we learned? And if you haven't seen it, we do have a couple of posters upstairs about our work to build confidence in election officials and build support for election officials, and also a second poster on how we translated that messaging into an influencer campaign at targeted audiences in the key states. So we need to continue to think collectively about how to innovate and get to the right audiences in order to have impact.
And use social media influencers for our communication strategy, which I would love to talk to everyone about for half an hour.
We will now have a short presentation from Katie Reisner. Katie Reisner is the Director of Public Safety and Elections at States United Democracy Center. There, she leads efforts to strengthen public safety for elections and prevent political violence. Prior to States United, she was counselor to the Secretary and Deputy Secretary of Homeland Security. She's also an attorney who previously lectured at Yale Law School, so very talented. Her lightning talk will focus on some of their public safety and election work. And welcome, Katie.
Thank you so much to the Bipartisan Policy Center, and thank you to Carah and Claire. It's quite fortuitous that you guys went just before this, because really the relationship between public safety and our mis and disinformation, our information environment, it's a really close relationship. I mean, how many people during Thanksgiving had to use some version of the talking points that Carah and Claire mentioned about non-citizen voting? Maybe I'm alone on that, but I definitely had to use some of that messaging. States United Democracy Center is a nonpartisan election protection organization. We focus on free, fair, and secure elections. And we do this by really providing the folks on the front lines of democracy with all sorts of resources that they need. I lead our public safety and elections work inside of the organization. And we really, for the 2024 election, had 4 key areas of focus. Election protection, so ensuring that we help states defend strong voting laws, election results, and litigate major voting issues. We have an accountability program that really helps ensure that those who seek to undermine democracy face the appropriate consequences, like bar complaints and civil liability. We have a Truth in Elections program that focuses on ensuring that falsehoods about our elections are met with appropriate correct information, working closely with folks like the good folks at Issue 1. And then my team, the Public Safety and Elections team, we're focused on physical threats to our election environment. To do this, we work closely with law enforcement leaders all across the country. I want to just if you take nothing else from what I shared today, I just want to offer one big thought, and I think it's been a through line of many of the remarks you've heard today. But the 2024 election saw, I think the public experienced it as really orderly, peaceful, and that's a thing that should be celebrated. But that should not be confused with 2 things. That should not be confused with any sense that it was experienced as safe and orderly because nothing was happening. There were no physical threats to our elections. That would be the wrong take. And it should not be confused with a conclusion that the election was safe and orderly because it just happened organically that way. I just want to make sure all of us in this room are ready to sustain the efforts that we all undertook and that our partners out all across the country undertook to ensure that this election was safe and orderly, so that we can really redouble those efforts in 2026 and 2028. So I'll just speak to sort of some of how we do this here. As we work with law enforcement leaders all across the country, we work with a range of partners, the National Policing Institute for the Police Executive Research Forum, the International Association of Chiefs of Police, National Organization of Black Law Enforcement Executives, National Association of Women Law Enforcement Executives. You get the idea. Pretty much all of the leading policing organizations have also, over the past several years, become increasingly seized of the idea that, yes, elections are something that law enforcement has to focus on, too, in a thoughtful way. We really bring kind of 3 big buckets of work to law enforcement folks. Training. We create peer-to-peer environments where law enforcement leaders can learn from one another and pick up ideas that have worked in one place and take them to another. We go deep into agencies and do deep training all up and down the ranks with folks so that they are really comprehensively internalizing some of these lessons learned. And we go and speak to statewide and nationwide organizations. We also do tabletop training. We help folks think about some of the most harrowing but also plausible scenarios that could come to pass during the height of the election season and ensure that folks' plans are really up to meet the moment. And we develop a really broad library of resources to ensure that folks are sharing information. One of the chiefs we work with likes to say there's no copyright in law enforcement, and that's a good thing. So what were we looking at ahead of this election? We were preparing for a range of threats. We were prepared for a big spate of bomb threats. Folks will remember that just in the beginning of this year, we saw a spate of bomb threats, hoax bomb threats at U.S. capitals, and that was really a helpful primer for folks to get ready to address this in the upcoming election cycle. We were preparing with law enforcement leaders to address threats to ballot drop boxes and to polling locations and ballot tabulation centers. voter intimidation, incidents involving firearms, and white powder substances. So what did we actually see? We really did see all of these things come to pass. We saw bomb threats all across the country. They were made in dozens of polling locations, including Arizona, Georgia, Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, all sorts of battleground states. While none of them were deemed credible, there were places that did have to evacuate. There were places where folks, the vote was disrupted. We saw damages to ballot drop boxes. We saw arson at ballot drop boxes in Washington and Oregon and Arizona. And we saw incidents of some additional instances of physical intimidation. So what worked here? And what I will say is we're still in the process of doing one-on-one after-action conversations with law enforcement leaders to really identify what did you do and what went well. And I just want to kind of offer 3 big themes. We're going to be continuing to develop resources coming out of this election that we'll make available for 26 and 28 moving forward. But what we saw was a really amazing set of flexible leaders. People were looking around the country and seeing, for example, the arson in Washington and Oregon, and then using that as an opportunity to get ready in their jurisdiction and think about, okay, we got to bring fire in and help and really identify how are we going to handle arson if it comes here to our jurisdiction. Training, because folks had been prepared to think about hoax bomb threats, people had done amazing stuff in advance to ensure that they were ready to address a hoax bomb threat. Someone we work with in one of the states did a census of all the bomb-sniffing dogs in his state and knew where every single one was relative to every single county. And that was a fantastic practice. And communication. We have seen a lot of efforts by a lot of folks in this room to really bring together election officials and law enforcement leaders to have a deep conversation. And that communication about needs and resources has yielded fantastic results. As a result of this, we've seen significant improvements to places that were really vulnerable, like ballot tabulation centers. And so, just really kind of moving ahead, I'm going to close where I started, which is by saying that we can't let our feet off the pedals. The threat environment is going to continue to mutate and change. We need everyone in the election space, especially law enforcement leaders, to continue to sustain their focus, continue that excellent training, preparation, communication, so that we can ensure that may every election be as seemingly free of a disruption as this past one was. Our contact information is up there, and some of our additional resources can be found at the link on the slide. And thank you all so much.
We are now going to transition to a panel reflecting on some of the threats that we anticipated in advance of the election. For those of you in the room who participated in tabletops, all of those things that we were talking about for months and months leading up to November. Before I introduce our moderator and panelists, I want to give a quick administrative note. So we have these very fancy printed agendas. We had to print them last week, and since then we updated the name of the next breakout. So you'll see that the final breakout of the day is titled Deep Dive on Election Law. It is actually titled Western Democracies, the U.S. Election in Context. That breakout is going to follow this panel, and it's going to feature a presentation by one of the panelists, Richard Pildes, and then it's going to feature a facilitated conversation. So just keep in mind that the online agenda is correct, and that will happen after this panel. All right, so the panel is being moderated by BPC's Dr. Will Adler. Will is the Associate Director of the Elections Project here at BPC. Prior to joining BPC, he worked in elections policy at the Center for Democracy and Technology. So Will, I'll hand it off to you.
Thanks so much, Rachel. And I'm really glad to be following that States United presentation because I think a lot of what we're going to talk about is just going to be building on exactly what Katie just talked about. So for the last few years, the democracy policy community, many people in this room, has been preparing for a number of threats to the year's election. Some of these threats materialized, but others seem, to the public, perhaps, to amount to very little. So why is that? Were these threats overhyped? Or did the hard work of the community here successfully neutralize them? Can we put these threats to bed, or do we need to remain vigilant in this cycle or in future cycles? So we have a great group of intellectuals and practitioners here who are going to explore these questions, hoping to prepare for and evaluate the possibility of future potential crises. So I'll start by introducing our panelists. We have Jennifer Morrell. Jennifer Morrell is the CEO and co-founder of the Elections Group, which is a nonpartisan team of election experts, including former election officials who partner with state and local election jurisdictions looking to implement new programs or new processes. Jennifer has served as an election official herself in Utah and Colorado and is a nationally recognized expert on various aspects of election administration, including post-election audits, chain of custody, and security, and she is also an Air Force veteran. Professor Richard H. Pildes is the Sudler Family Professor of Constitutional Law at NYU Law. Professor Pildes is one of the nation's top scholars on constitutional law and election law in particular. He formerly clerked for Supreme Court Justice Thurgood Marshall, has been elected into the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and the American Law Institute, and was appointed by President Biden to the President's Commission on the Supreme Court. He's also one of the editors of an upcoming book, Electoral Reform in the United States, Proposals for Combating Polarization and Extremism, and there's a launch event for the book just a week from now here in DC. So. Katie Harbath is the Chief Global Affairs Officer at Duco Experts, a technology consulting firm. She's also the CEO of Anchor Change and the author of an excellent Substack on democracy, elections, and technology. I recommend you subscribe. Before working at Duco, she was the Director of Technology and Democracy for the International Republican Institute and a fellow at the Bipartisan Policy Center. She also spent 10 years at Facebook managing global election strategy and has worked at the RNC and the National Republican Senatorial Committee on Digital Strategy. So thank you all for being here. So, like I said, folks in this room have done a lot of work to anticipate the threats to last month's election, but it seemed to most observers relatively smooth. So why is that? There are a few possibilities, right? The threats were overhyped, neutralized by preparation, dependent on the results perhaps, or still lurking beneath the surface. And these aren't mutually exclusive, right? It could be all of these things. And I want to reflect on that question with you all, and I'm so glad to have you here because you all speak to these different domains that are so critical: election administration, election law, and the online information environment. So Jennifer, I want to start with you. I think that a member of the public who reads the news might look at the election we just had and think, well, I read in advance about all these issues we were going to have. People were going to have all these issues casting their ballots. Officials were going to have all these problems running the election and counting the ballots. But it seemed to go fine. So, is that true? What would you say to someone who says, it looks like the U.S. elections are in great shape. Everything went great.
Yeah, thank you, Will. It's wonderful to be here with all of you. So I think we certainly do need to celebrate the success, and preparation is definitely at the top of that. You've heard that throughout the convening today. We just heard that preparation in terms of collaboration with local law enforcement, tabletop training exercises. We saw better voter list maintenance efforts than we've, I think, ever seen, better recruitment and training of poll workers, more post-election audits, my favorite thing, focus on chain of custody, ballot reconciliation, ballot accounting. I've seen more instances of that happening in offices than I've seen before. So there's certainly a win there. Better communication, we had a whole panel on that. That's a really exciting thing. But I think there is sort of an unseen wound or an unseen issue that's really important to acknowledge and talk about. And so you heard it, but I'm going to make you all maybe feel it for just a minute, because I want you to think about the hardest day you've ever had at work. And I want you to think about what it would be like to repeat that day for maybe 27, we heard earlier, right? 27 days without a day off. 27 days, maybe 30 days, maybe 90 days, maybe 4 years. Some folks in the room might say that, right? Of experiencing long days, days where you're being scrutinized, criticized, having to take calls and emails from the public. And as we ramp up towards Election Day, not only are you dealing with the physical and emotional sort of burnout that brings, but as you heard from Issue 1 and others, you're being alerted to threats directed at yourself, directed at your office, maybe directed at others in your state, and you're internalizing that. You're wondering, are my preparations enough? Is my training enough? Is the bulletproof glass I put in going to be enough? Are we prepared? Is the corridor I put around my building going to really stop somebody coming in with a bomb in their car? These things become real and they continue to compound. As you heard Charles say, you're running 3 elections. If you're lucky in a building that was maybe state-of-the-art 50 years ago, but most likely in a courthouse that was built at the turn of the century, you're stepping on each other and you don't have room for all the things that you need to do. And that adds to the stress. And as election day comes and it starts at 5 a.m. and you probably didn't go home until 10 p.m. the night before, and it's all the normal things that we deal with, polling locations not opening up, maybe lines somewhere, other issues. Your staff is exhausted because they've been processing voter registration and ballot request forms probably day in and day out for weeks and all the other things. So there's already this sort of like building stress and concern. But on election day, those threats, that chaos really built and escalated. And in addition to hearing that and taking all of that in, you're dealing with calls from the media. We saw more observers coming into facilities. So people now that you're not sure, are they here to do harm? Are they here to do their important part in our democratic process of observing? And then our bomb threats started. And as you heard, initially, there were polling locations that were evacuated and offices evacuated. And maybe by the time they get to your office, you're told it's just a hoax. You can stay and keep working, keep doing your job, but we're gonna run some bomb sniffing dogs through. Just don't be bothered by that. I have cemented in my memory on election night working alongside an office where I heard a director call her young son at 7 o'clock just to tell him that she loved him and she hadn't seen him for a while. So I think there's some collateral damage that we probably haven't seen or experienced yet in the form of trauma and post-traumatic stress and burnout that we've seen coming, that we know has led to turnover, and that I worry is going to continue to sort of erode that institutional knowledge that has really made this election a success and sort of held things together. So I think that is, when we talk about the health of our democracy, I think that's one of the things the public doesn't see.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Since you brought up these personal threats to election officials, Rick, I want to ask you about this. In your 2022 paper, Election Law in an Age of Distrust, you wrote about this issue of election officials being the subject of harassment and threats. We saw the presentation from Paul Manson and Paul Gronke this morning of the data that they've collected, which shows that this is actually getting worse for election officials. So, Paul noted that most local election officials know an LEO who fears for their personal safety. 15% report receiving personal threats, and they report actually changing the processes to account for this. So, Rick, do you think this has risen to the level where Congress or state legislators should do something? What can and should they do?
Yes, I do think that Congress should do more to provide more protections in federal law to preserve the integrity of the election process, to let election workers, election officials know that the federal government kind of has their back. One of the important things that was done during this cycle, I don't know if it was talked about this morning, is that Bob Bauer and Ben Ginsberg, who were top lawyers for Republicans and Democrats in the past, created this Election Defenders Network, or elections, I forget the exact title, in which they put together pro bono lawyers from around the country who were prepared to defend election officials because one of the risks they face, Jennifer probably knows much more about than I do, in a number of states, laws were passed that were risky for election officials because there could be second guessing of judgments that were made. Suddenly, these issues might become criminal issues under state law. This is terrifying for people who are mostly volunteers working in the polling places. And so I think one of the things I had hoped Congress would do more with when it passed the Electoral Count Reform Act was to build in stronger protections in federal law to protect election officials. It was one of the things that was discussed as part of the Electoral Count Reform Act changes, but there wasn't enough support to really put some very strong teeth in federal law. There are provisions that exist. There are provisions in some state laws. But I do think that we need to let the election officials know that they're going to have protection against the threats that are not going to go away after this election cycle.
Yeah, absolutely. Katie, you've been thinking for a long time about how elections play out online, and it seems like the source of many of the information that leads to these kinds of threats are related to decisions that the companies make about online content moderation. So, after the Russian influence operations of 2016, companies started taking content moderation around elections really seriously. 2020 saw some pretty interesting efforts from the companies, but it seems like there's kind of been a backlash in the years since. In your view, how did that affect the election?
Yeah, I think there's a couple of things to point out here. One, I do want to point out, Jennifer and I were talking before this about sort of the same conversations you were having with election officials, I was having with trust and safety folks. And I was having with folks inside the companies or folks that were working on misinformation, that were at universities, that were under attack from Jim Jordan and others, that were facing a lot of the very similar, resilience challenges of every single day. You're being scrutinized externally, internally, you're being pressured to do different stuff. Your to-do list is longer than what you can possibly do. And I think that that's a portion that people don't necessarily think of, because when we think of these companies, we oftentimes just think of the CEOs and the folks at the top, and we don't think about the frontline workers. And I think sometimes it's important to separate out the folks that are just trying to do the job with what they've been given by their senior leaders versus the decisions that they're making. There were changes to how these companies approach this stuff for sure. A lot of that from some of the pressure that came from different folks, mostly Republicans, around all of this. But I know for a fact, I worked with a ton of these companies. There was a lot of work that was happening behind the scenes. They were just less public about it. Now, whether or not that's good or not, I think is a worthwhile discussion. But many of them were not, because they too did not want to get attacked. Many of these trust and safety workers had been doxxed in 2020. I can give you a long litany of ways that I've been attacked in both the left and the right for this work that's being done. And so they too were having to make these trade-offs of how public are we about this work that we do beforehand versus after. And Facebook, Meta, just yesterday, put out a long post about stuff they had done around global elections on all of this. And I think it is worthwhile for us to continue to debate the policies that these companies have and how well they can execute on those policies around some of these threats, where a lot of the conversations I was having is, okay, where's the line? Where's the line from a legitimate criticism against a public figure versus where does it turn into harassment? What do we do about that? What does that look like? And of course, you had different platforms. X, I have to put in its whole own category, because it did pull back. It did have far less people on trust and safety. It was having a lot more, as the graphs that issue 1 showed, a lot more stuff that was happening. But then you also had AI. And you had AI companies now here for the first time. And I think AI is one of those things that I think was overhyped. But I liken it to how social media was used by Obama in 2008. And we should be prepared. It's going to be used so much more in 2028. And in fact, internationally, we saw campaigns using AI quite a bit in all this. But that doesn't mean, as again, issue 1 stuff showed, there was still a lot of misinformation out there. We did have the US government sharing a lot more about the disinformation networks and the foreign networks and stuff that they were seeing. But it all did look a little bit different. And I think we're in a moment now where we need to kind of regroup and repivot as we think about this, because the threats are changing. Mm-hmm. The threats are changing. How we're consuming information is going to change so much in the next 2 to 3 years. I can't tell you exactly what it's going to look like, but it is going to be different. And so I think as we collect these lessons from what we've learned from here, how we look at it, and how do we define what was success or not success around this, particularly around on the tech side and online, how do we now use that to shape this next chapter of what it's going to look like?
So I was going to ask you about AI disinformation. You said it was overhyped. Charles this morning said maybe people think it was a nothing burger. Do you think that to the extent that it was a nothing burger, is that because the companies were pressured into taking action on it? You said it's the companies are being quieter about what they're doing, but how can we judge whether their actions are effective?
So I think it was a combination of things. I think one, the technology is still pretty new. So people are still learning how to actually use it. A lot of the companies and the AI companies in general, a lot of the folks that work at places like OpenAI and other places came from a lot of my teams at Facebook, a lot of other places that have gone through this. And so a lot of them, you know, some just decided to not allow any politics at all. Some decided to have, you know, they tried to find the responsible ways in which to do that. At BPC, we did a roundtable with OpenAI in 2023, I think it was, to kind of talk about some of these issues. And so I think part of it was what the companies had put into place. It was far from perfect, but they were from the outset saying they were going to be thinking about this. The media paying attention to it played, I think, a big role here in the US of it not being used as much. Internationally is a whole other question, and I know we're not really focused on that yet, but I wrote a whole piece on it today in the newsletter if you want to hear more. And I think there's some lessons we can learn from internationally that we should be looking at for here. But I think also we have a tendency to focus on the shiny object, which was AI. And there was a lot of like, oh my God, this could happen, this could happen. This is why I came up with my whole panic responsibly mantra, which I think we should continue on going forward, trying to separate out the signal from the noise on this. And we shouldn't take our eye off the fact that it was still cheap fakes. It was still other methods of trying to push some of this information that still was what we saw the bulk of it happening.
Mm-hmm. Panicking responsibly is kind of the theme of this talk, right? the preparations that we made. Jennifer, what were some of the threats that election officials, you think, spent the most time preparing for, and what was the impact of that kind of preparation?
I think the biggest win for this election is the collaboration that happened between local election officials and their local law enforcement partners in thinking about physical security. So certainly was the first time I remember seeing pretty much across the board those local law enforcement officials being a participant in those tabletop training exercises and exercising through not just the cybersecurity threats and the operational threats, but talking about some of these specific physical incidents that might happen, whether it's a disruption at the polling place, somebody coming to your election facility and trying to cause harm. But I think that's where a lot of the focus was, because again, we did a great job sort of monitoring that talk that was happening on these multiple social media platforms and making sure that those officials were aware that they weren't caught off guard, but it also created that sort of like anxiety and need to make sure that they were prepared to respond to incidents that for many of them they'd never had to deal with before. I know this year for many offices, this was the first year that they had active shooter training or de-escalation training for their poll workers.
So I wonder if you can compare this year to 2020 a little bit, both in terms of the stress that you mentioned election officials being under this year. 2020 was a different kind of stress, right? Getting ready to hold an all-male election, and the preparations, I'm guessing, were radically different for the particular challenges in 2020.
Certainly we saw some of this misinformation coming, but really we didn't know what was on the other end of that election, and we were focused on making sure people could vote in a way that's safe. But I think the resource constraints that we started this convening out hearing about, not enough people, not the right space, that certainly was there in 2020. It's still there today. And the add part is these officials and probably all of us feel like we're under a microscope, right? We're being scrutinized for everything we say and everything we do. And this real anxiety about making a mistake, an honest mistake, or saying the wrong thing in an email or in a text or in a meeting like this that's recorded and made public. So, part of that is because we don't have enough people to do all the things well. And so we have to make these decisions and these trade-offs. Right? Do we do a thorough reconciliation and risk not reporting results early enough in the night? Do we make our ballot collections teams go through this exhaustive sort of chain of custody process, or do we quickly want to gather those ballots and get them back into our facility where they're safe? So there's a lot of trade-offs, so different, but still trying to run good, safe, accurate elections on a limited budget, limited number of people, and certainly not adequate space.
Mm-hmm. So we've talked about the threats to election workers. We've talked about the big anticipated threat of AI disinformation. I want to pivot to talking about election subversion. So this got a lot of attention in the run-up to the election. Congress even passed a bill to partly address it, which we heard about from Michael Thorning of BPC a few hours ago, the Electoral Count Reform Act. election subversion refers to a pretty broad set of things. Rick, I wonder what set of problems were people referring to when they talked about that threat, and were people right to be worried about it?
Well, I divide this into sort of 3 phases of the process. That there are worries at each phase. So the first phase is leading up to Election Day and on Election Day. The second phase is between Election Day and when the media is prepared to declare a winner of the election. And then the third is what happens after that, all the way up to January 6th. As far as the Election Day phase of it went, remember, there were a lot of worries in advance that there were going to be thousands of poll watchers and they might disrupt the process. There would be perhaps challengers at the polls who would challenge voters' eligibility and disrupt the process. There was concern about potential violence. You won't remember, but the Republican National Committee had been under a consent decree going back to the early 80s that constrained what they could do in what's called ballot security programs. And that was ended in 2018, and there was a lot of concern in some quarters what would happen in 2020 or 2024. And none of this stuff really materialized. The bomb threats were an issue, but aside from that, there weren't significant problems at the polling places. So there was a lot of anxiety about that. We should be glad, to remember the anxieties and notice that didn't materialize.
Well, why do you think that didn't materialize? Is it just there's a lot of polling places, or what?
I think that in every presidential election I've been involved in, there's been this anxiety about what might happen in the polling places with poll watchers or intimidation and the like. I had kind of minimized that in prior elections. I was more uncertain going into this election. But I think it's part of the generalized anxiety, we now have about the election process. We're operating in a sea of what I call pervasive distrust of the process. And there's distrust from both sides. Each side has different things they're suspicious about. But I think that feeds this kind of anxiety. On top of that, we're in an era in which elections are perceived as existential by many people on both sides, meaning this is not the normal process of sometimes we win and sometimes we lose. The country will never be the same if the other side wins. That's a belief a lot of people have on both sides, and I'm not saying they're wrong about that. But that leads to tremendous anxiety about every single dimension of the election process, as if Western civilization will turn on whether we have this policy or that policy with regard to the polling places. So I think that they did a great job preparing election officials for their role, and these things fortunately didn't materialize. The thing I was always most worried about, which didn't materialize for other reasons, is the second stage, which is the length of time it would take to get to a resolution of the presidential election process. I always thought that was the greatest vulnerability in our system. I said this actually before the 2020 election, and I thought that would be an even bigger problem in this election. And that didn't materialize only because the outcome was decisive enough and was resolved, fairly early on. But I think we should not neglect that issue, because if you pay attention to things like, when was the Pennsylvania Senate election resolved? Casey conceded 17 days after the election. Now, maybe he could have conceded a few days earlier, but imagine the presidential election not being capable of being resolved in Pennsylvania for 14 days or 10 days. In Arizona, the media didn't declare a victor until Saturday after Election Day. And so I think that still remains, that second phase, a major point of vulnerability in the context of a close presidential election. I think we are in such a culture of distrust that it's very important to try to design policies and the process so we can get to an accurate result as quickly as possible, because I think that's a real potential problem. The third phase was the worry that election officials at the local level or maybe at the state level would refuse to certify results or would in various ways try to question the process even when there was not a legitimate basis for doing so. And I just think we weren't tested about that. I mean, some of this did happen, by the way, in Pennsylvania. I don't know how many of you paid attention to this, but there were a few county officials, this was Democratic county officials, who wanted to defy the state Supreme Court and count ballots that the court had said were not valid votes. And one of them said, well, what does precedent mean? Precedent doesn't mean anything. It's a kind of terrible statement in the election context. The Pennsylvania Supreme Court came back in and reaffirmed its ruling on these ballots, and then the election officials backed down. But fundamentally, the system wasn't tested on that issue because the election wasn't close enough. Those challenges were probably going to come more from Republican officials who had become election officials based on their distrust of what had happened in 2020. I think the system would have been able to handle that challenge. I think some of the anxiety in advance was overblown. It's very difficult to know how to prepare people without going over the cliff. And I think some of the pre-election commentary was taking people over the cliff, to scenarios that were just not very realistic. Partly because the statute that you mentioned that Congress passed, the Bipartisan Electoral Count Reform Act, actually addressed a lot of the scenarios that people were worried about, even though they didn't understand that the statute actually, addressed those issues. But we weren't challenged.
Do you think we needed to be taken over the cliff of fear in order to get the ECRA passed?
No, I don't. I mean, I think Congress, after the 2020 election, realized that the statute we were operating under, which is the statute that governs the relationship between the state process and what Congress does on January 6th, that was a statute from the late 19th century. It was anachronistic. It was incredibly badly drafted. There was bipartisan recognition. They had to fix that. They had to modernize that. Actually, it was very gratifying. I was pretty heavily involved in that legislative process, but it was gratifying because no one was paying attention. So they were willing to listen to academics who knew something about election law because they knew they needed to fix the statute and they knew they didn't understand it. But a bipartisan ad hoc group was put together by Senators Manchin and Collins and pushed that through as the last thing the previous Congress, at the end of the congressional session. I think that was critical. Now, hopefully that statute never comes into play because the process operates smoothly. But that statute did things, I'm not going to go through everything, but for example, it made it clear states have to resolve these election issues through laws enacted in advance of the election, meaning that legislatures can't come in after the fact and start changing election law after votes have been cast. That was one of the worries people had. There are a variety of other safeguards and guardrails built into that statute. And so I think that does provide significant protection going forward. But we weren't tested at that third phase.
Yeah.
Can I add something, Will, that Rick just brought up? I think that quick results reporting is worth sort of reminding everybody that that was a big win this election, and that didn't just happen. In those large jurisdictions that struggled in 2020 to get results quickly, they did expand their space. They did hire more temporary workers. They ran often 24-hour shifts this election, which is tough to do, meaning you still need internally full-time managers to oversee those midnight shifts. But that happened this election, and I think we certainly have seen the benefit of that quicker.
But we can still do more on that front. So I'm still very unhappy with state legislatures in places like Pennsylvania and Wisconsin that refuse to allow their election officials to begin the process of processing, not counting, but processing absentee ballots that come in before Election Day, so they're ready to be counted right away on election night when polls close. That's an easy problem to fix. They have refused to do it. It's a little hard to understand why exactly. There are partisan political fights around these issues, but that's a no-brainer to me.
Yeah.
And that would help speed the process up. And there are other policy things that can be done. But I agree with what Jennifer said. I would add some of these jurisdictions bought new equipment that cost a lot of money, like in Pennsylvania, so they could process more quickly. So there's recognition that this is a vulnerability. But there's more we can do to get to accurate results more quickly.
Yeah, absolutely. Katie, did you feel like the companies that you've talked to were also treating the period after polls closed and before the presidential result was called as a key vulnerable time?
Yeah, Nicole Schneiderman at Protect Democracy and I put together a series of briefings looking at that period. And I was very, very pleasantly surprised. We gave briefings to pretty much all the companies. We sent the information to pretty much all of them who wanted to know, and they were trying to think through, okay, what are all these dates going to be? When do I have to have 24-hour coverage? When can I just have, coverage during the regular day? What are the threats? What are these going to look like? What are we going to potentially have to anticipate? And what are the processes we have to have in place around that decision making and everything? There was a lot of anxiety in the companies of similar to the election officials, right? We all were like, there's only so much you can do to prepare, and it's until you live through it do you know if you were ready or not. And that is a really hard thing mentally to live through day in and day out, because there comes a point in time, right, where you're like, I can't do anymore. We now just have to hope that what we put into place works. And I think that a theme that I'm hearing throughout all this, and I did so much red teaming, me and my team and others I worked with, so much red teaming with the tech companies too. So much red teaming of their processes, of how their systems were generating content on like the AI front and all of that, to try to make sure and do the best that they could of making sure at least accurate information about where, when, and how to vote would exist. The challenge that we had about thinking this post-election period, though, was when the facts are fuzzy. Like, do you all remember when the ship hit that bridge in Baltimore? Or even when there were some of the attacks in Israel, and you don't know all the facts. You don't necessarily have an authoritative source to point to. You can point to, here's the process, and that's where we were trying to like, okay, you may not be able to say this is how it's going to end up, but let me point you to the process so that you know there's an authoritative source of like, here's what this is going to go through so that people are prepared, the general public is prepared for all of that. But asking the companies or anybody that does anything in the content world, how do you handle that, is a challenge that I think we need to explore a bit more of what that should look like in that that process after election night, before both when the news orgs call it, but then also before January 6th and even the inauguration, we were saying there's going to be periods of time here, and I couldn't get clear signal from folks of how everybody had different ideas of how that type of content should be handled. And some platforms like Meta just decide we're just downranking all politics and news because we don't want to have to be making those decisions. And that had its own backlash in and all of it. And my thing is that platforms can run, but they can't hide from politics. And so as we're thinking about these next, there's always another election that's coming. As we're starting to prepare for those and think about those are some of the areas that I wouldn't mind having a bit more discussion on of that post-election time period. Because even though it didn't happen this time, it doesn't mean it's not going to happen in the future. And there's so much we can keep building on from this preparation. Because the more that we do this, the more resilient you do come to of being like, oh, I may not know exactly how this is going to unfold, but I can handle it, right? Like, I know we've got the processes in place to try to make sure, I know we've got the partnerships, I know we got the things to do this. Is it going to be stressful? Heck yes. But there's something to that of keep repeating it, that you start to, I don't want to get complacent about it, but it's something that you just it brings the anxiety down just a smidge more.
In terms of focusing on the things that that we can actually do, counting faster, trying to reduce that period of vulnerability as much as possible, that's one of them. But Jennifer, you've talked about the issue of other like preventable operational mistakes in elections happening and being picked up on and leveraged to sow distrust. What kind of mistakes did we see this year? Did any of them like blow up in the press, or was it just that the presidential race was called and everybody moved on?
We'll start at the end. I think the media did a great job in sort of contextualizing some of the mistakes we saw. There are like 5 key things. So my organization ran a series of workshops in 2022 and 2023 with election officials to try to identify some key areas of election administration that were so important to not go wrong that performing an audit or a test or some sort of quality control check was worth doing. Some of those things were voter registration, list maintenance. We certainly heard a lot of that. Ballot proofing is probably the most boring election administration and tedious election administration task that you will do. But we saw issues, right, where there were candidates left off the ballot or spelled incorrectly or last minute changes because proofing hadn't been able to be done thoroughly. That led to issues down the line. So maybe we proofed late. That meant we didn't get to thoroughly test and didn't realize till after election day or election day that those ballots couldn't be scanned. So ballot proofing was a big one. Chain of custody, I call it ballot management, chain of custody, ballot accounting, ballot reconciliation. Anytime we see a headline about ballots being discovered having not been scanned or counted after the election or during a recount, those can always be tied back to jurisdictions' accounting practices or ballot management practices. So we saw a few of those, and certainly that's an area where I think we can do better. I think the other one that was interesting is the number of mail ballot print issues that we saw. And as we think back to Charles's slide and we see that sort of increase, right, towards more people voting by mail, it means that there are more external vendors entering the space. So there certainly are good, qualified companies that have done this for years and years with success. We have new folks coming in, and we certainly saw some issues. And I'll just point out again, in at least the jurisdictions I worked with that experienced those where ballots didn't go out correctly, were mailed to the wrong voters, or just couldn't be scanned at all. Often they went with a company that was the cheapest because, again, they were resource constrained in terms of what they could spend on that. So those are three of my big ones where I think we can improve, we can do better. Again, it's like being able to comfortably talk about the problems without fear of those somehow boiling into a new conspiracy.
Yeah, and somehow it seems like none of them really boiled into
No, and I credit the media for that. I think they did a phenomenal job, again, reporting on it, contextualizing it, and helping people understand the other layers of security that made sure that that election for that jurisdiction was still conducted fairly and accurately.
Yeah. Rick, going back to election subversion, since we're talking about things at the local level and in this kind of third phase that you were talking about, do you think we're out of the woods there? Do you think we've done enough to prevent that kind of subversion? It seems like this year, people who have questioned the result of the 2020 election had a little bit more success at the local level than they did in, say, 2022, when I think they sort of flopped across the board.
I doubt we can change this, but it's worth mentioning that the way we run our elections is fairly unique among democracies.
Mm-hmm.
So, especially for even
It's
for
the exception, not the
presidential,
rule.
yeah,
Yep.
especially even for the most national election,
Yep.
to the most powerful office in the world, right? We have this highly decentralized system, and partly that means that we have, every state will have its own fights over this policy or that policy, and you'll have state courts being brought into the picture in different states, and depending on the composition of the legislature or the governor's office, the policies may flip back and forth. And we have typically partisan elected officials who oversee the process. And the most extreme example back in 2000, when Florida was the epicenter of all the controversies, the Attorney General was the chair of the Democratic campaign, the Secretary of State was the chair of the Republican campaign in the state. No other country has elected officials, including officials elected on a partisan basis, playing such a critical role. They typically have independent election administrative bodies, or they have electoral courts. They have a national, it's a single national kind of process. So I think all of these discussions are taking place in that larger context, which we kind of take for granted because this is how we just have always done it. But it does introduce the greater risks both of actual subversion and worries about the subversion or perceptions of subversion. Mm-hmm. Now, I would be very happy to see us creating independent entities or officials who oversee the election process. I know Kevin Johnson was here earlier. He's been devoting his efforts and his organization to that.
He's got a poster upstairs.
Yeah. I don't know how likely that is. And because the process is so decentralized, it's also unclear how much how much power Congress has to step in and kind of address some of these issues as a national matter. So for House and Senate elections, Congress has full power to regulate the process. For the presidential election, it's more uncertain what Congress's power is. And in fact, one of the major cases that I think will be going to the Supreme Court on the election process, which connects to the issue about non-citizen voting discussion, is Arizona's effort to require proof of citizenship, which they do require now and can for state elections, to require it for the presidential election. Right now, there's a federal statute that governs registration for the presidential election. Arizona says Congress doesn't have the power under the Constitution to regulate the presidential election in this way. That's going to be a big, big issue before the Supreme Court. And if the court holds that Congress doesn't have power over the presidential election to regulate matters like this, then you're going to see even more kind of proliferation of political disputes or policy disputes at the state level over the presidential election.
Yeah. So as we close out, I just want to hear what you all think the key vulnerabilities are that we need to patch maybe next year. Unclear whether Congress is going to be interested in moving on elections, but certainly some state legislatures will be wanting to move on that. I think I already heard from Rick, key vulnerability being the processing time of ballots. But Jennifer, what do you think?
We need to continue to invest in our workforce. We need to make sure that these officials and their staff are adequately trained and paid and have the resources, the facilities, the staffing that they need to continue to do all the things that we talked about today that contributed to the success of this election.
Katie, what do you think?
Yeah, I'm going to say two, but they're kind of interrelated, which is one, I realized I didn't talk enough, I think, about Musk. And part of the reason for that is our information environment is very fragmented. X was not even one of the top places that a lot of people were going, but it doesn't take a lot of people to cause harm. I have friends who've personally been harmed by Elon Musk and what he's put up on the platform, and I think that that's something we absolutely need to pay attention to, but I thought that there was sometimes a little bit too much attention on what was happening on X and not enough being paid attention to the overall information environment that we were in. And my thing and our biggest vulnerability, but the biggest opportunity for us to shape right now is AI, is how AI is going to change anything with a feed. Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, whatever has a feed is going to start having AI-generated summaries at the top. AI is going to play a bigger and bigger role in how we all consume information, and now is the time that we have to help to shape that, to help to think about what that looks like, to help to get ahead of that curve. But if we don't, and if we don't pay attention to it, there's going to be a vulnerability in there that we potentially weren't paying attention to that becomes a new sort of shock thing where something happened. For instance, in Romania right now, a person who got first place in the first round of elections is somebody who only campaigned on TikTok, and he came completely out of nowhere. And now it's in front of that electoral court to try to decide if they do a recount, if they do a rerun of the election, was it Russian interference? It was just a total shock to the country's system, and they're kind of in chaos right now while they try to figure that out. And so I think, again, there's lessons to be learned there of how do we make sure we're not just fighting the last war, but also thinking about the one that's coming.
Great. Thanks so much. It was so great to hear from all of you, and let's hear it from all of you for our panelists.